I didn't steal anything. This is my money. Celine Vaughn stood trembling at the customer service counter, her voice breaking with frustration as she pleaded. But bank manager Vivian Langford's face twisted with pure disgust as she stared down at the young black girl. A girl like you with this much cash? I don't think so. You probably robbed someone. Celine's eyes filled with tears as the humiliation hit her. This was supposed to be simple. She was just trying to open her first checking account. Please, just let me call my mom, she begged. Vivian sneered with cold satisfaction. Save it for the police. I'm not falling for your sob story. Without hesitation, she grabbed the phone and dialed. Yes, I need officers immediately. I have a young thief trying to deposit stolen money. But Vivian Langford had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her career, because in a short while she would discover exactly who Celine's mother was, and when she did, her entire world came crashing down. What happened next exposed not just Vivian's shocking racism, but a secret so powerful it changed everything. Before we start the story, if you stand against racism and prejudice, click the subscribe button, type yes, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. You will definitely get a reply from us. A bright afternoon, Celine Vaughn practically bounced with excitement as she stepped off the city bus downtown. Today wasn't just any day. Today was the day she finally proved to her mother that she was responsible enough to handle her own banking. For weeks, Celine had been planning this moment. She'd researched different types of accounts online, practiced what she would say to the bank representative, and even rehearsed walking confidently through those glass doors. This wasn't just about opening a checking account. This was about independence, maturity, and taking her first real step into the adult world. Celine Vaughn lived in a world most teenagers could only dream of. Her days began in a mansion nestled in the exclusive Crestview Manor, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see. She attended a prestigious preparatory academy where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary, and where her biggest concern was maintaining her perfect academic record. But here's what made Celine different from other wealthy kids. She had no idea just how wealthy her family really was. Her mother had deliberately raised her to believe they were simply comfortable. Celine took the bus to school instead of being chauffeured in luxury cars. She shopped at normal stores, not designer boutiques. She earned her allowance by doing chores and maintaining good grades. This carefully constructed normal life was no accident. Dr. Elena Drake had learned from her own childhood that extreme wealth could be both a blessing and a curse. She remembered being constantly watched, photographed, and judged as the heir to a major banking empire. So when Celine was born, Elena made a decision that would shape her daughter's entire worldview. She would raise Celine to understand the value of hard work and humility before she ever learned about the family's true power. As Celine walked into Liberty Trust Bank that afternoon, she carried with her an envelope containing birthday money from her grandmother, money that represented months of careful saving and birthday gifts. In her backpack, she had her savings account statements showing money accumulated from allowances, holiday gifts, and small rewards for academic achievements. To Celine, this felt like a fortune. To her family, it was pocket change. The bank's lobby buzzed with typical afternoon activity. Business professionals in sharp suits hurried between teller windows, elderly customers patiently waited in the VIP section, and the soft hum of financial conversations filled the air. Celine took a deep breath, straightened her school uniform, and approached the customer service desk with a confidence that came from never having been treated as anything less than valued and respected. Celine walked up to the first available teller window with a bright smile, clutching her envelope of birthday money and her backpack full of documents. The nameplate on the counter read Corinne Hale, Customer Service Representative. Corinne looked up from her computer screen, and immediately her expression shifted when she saw the young black girl standing at her window. Her welcoming smile disappeared, replaced by a look of disgust and suspicion. "What do you want?" Corinne asked coldly, her voice dripping with hostility as she looked Celine up and down like she was something unpleasant. "Hi, good afternoon," Celine said cheerfully, trying to maintain her positive attitude despite the woman's obvious rudeness. "I'd like to open my first checking account, please. I'm really excited about this." Corinne let out a harsh laugh. "Are you serious right now? This is a real bank, not some community center. We don't just hand out accounts to every kid who wanders in here." Celine's smile began to falter. "I'm young, and I have all the required documentation. I've been saving for this." "Young?" Corinne interrupted with a sneer. "And let me guess, you've got cash from selling drugs or stealing from people. That's usually how kids like you get money around here." Celine felt like she'd been slapped. "Kids like me? I don't understand. I go to a good school. This is birthday money from my grandmother." "Sure it is," Corinne said mockingly. "A fancy school. Right. You probably stole that uniform too. I know exactly what kind of neighborhood you come from, and it's not the kind that sends kids to fancy schools. I'm calling my manager right now to deal with this situation. She knows exactly how to handle people like you. Corinne picked up her phone and dialed with a dramatic flourish. Vivian, you need to get over to window 3 immediately. I've got one of those urban kids here trying to scam us with suspicious cash. Yeah, exactly the type we talked about in our staff meeting. She's getting aggressive and making a scene. Within moments, bank manager Vivian Langford appeared at the teller window, ready to take control of what Corinne had described as a typical urban troublemaker situation. She looked up from her paperwork, her eyes immediately fixed on Celine, a young black girl standing in her pristine lobby, and something cold and calculating flashed across her face. The warm professional smile she typically reserved for customers never appeared. Shouldn't you be in school, young lady? Vivian's first words weren't welcoming or helpful. They were immediately accusatory, dripping with suspicion. Celine blinked, taken aback by the harsh tone, but maintained her polite demeanor. Oh, I have a permission from my school and my parents. I arranged to leave early specifically for this appointment. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a signed permission slip from her school counselor. But Vivian barely glanced at the paper. Her attention was fixed on the envelope Celine had placed on the counter. When Celine opened it to show her the neatly stacked bills, Vivian's expression darkened even further. That's a lot of cash for someone your age. Where did you get this? The question came out like an interrogation, not customer service. Celine felt the first flutter of confusion in her stomach. Why was this woman being so hostile? In her sheltered world, having money had never been questioned before. It's birthday money from my grandmother and some savings I'd been keeping at home. I wanted to deposit it all when I opened my checking account. Vivian's laugh was sharp and humorless. I find that hard to believe. Grandmothers don't typically give young people this much cash. The accusation hit Celine like a physical blow. She'd never had her honesty questioned before, never been treated with such open skepticism. But it's true. She always gives generous birthday gifts. I can show you the card she wrote with it. Celine fumbled through her backpack and produced a beautiful birthday card with her grandmother's handwriting. But Vivian waved it away without even looking. Anyone can write a card. These could all be fake, she said dismissively, gesturing at Celine's carefully prepared documentation. Meanwhile, across town in a gleaming high-rise office building, Dr. Elena Drake sat in the boardroom of Drake Financial Group, completely unaware that her daughter's protected world was beginning to crumble. Elena was in the middle of discussing a major acquisition deal with several other executives, a conversation that involved moving millions of dollars with casual ease. Elena had spent years crafting the perfect double life. In business circles, she was known as Elena Drake, the brilliant CEO who had taken her family's already successful financial empire and expanded it into new territories. Financial magazines featured her on their covers, business schools taught case studies about her innovative strategies, and competitors respected her shrewd decision-making. But in her personal life, she was simply Elena, Celine's mom, who drove carpool, attended parent-teacher conferences, and worried about normal teenage problems like homework and friendships. She used her married name, lived in a beautiful but not ostentatious home, and had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that Celine's childhood remained as normal as possible. This dual identity wasn't just about privacy, it was about protection. Elena remembered the pressures of growing up as banking royalty, the constant scrutiny, the way people treated her differently once they learned her last name. She was determined that Celine would develop her own character, her own values, and her own sense of self-worth before learning about the immense power and responsibility that would one day be hers. Back at the bank, Celine was experiencing culture shock in real time. She tried again to show Vivian her school identification, her birth certificate, and her savings account statements from the same bank, but Vivian's hostility only intensified. Look, sweetie, Vivian said, her voice dripping with condescension. Girls like you don't just walk around with this kind of money, honestly. I've been in banking a long time and I know suspicious activity when I see it. The words hit Celine like a slap. Girls like you. She'd heard those words before in movies, in news stories, but she'd never imagined they would be directed at her. In her sheltered bubble, she'd been protected from the harsh realities of racial prejudice, and now it was hitting her full force. Can you please just help me open an account? Celine asked, her voice beginning to waver as confusion and hurt crept in. I don't understand why you're being so mean to me. I just want to bank here like everyone else. But Vivian had already made her decision. Her prejudices, her resentments, and her newfound power had combined into a toxic mixture that blinded her to everything except her own biases. I don't think so. This money is probably stolen, and I'm not even going to be part of whatever scheme you're running. Desperation began to creep into Celine's voice. It's not stolen. Please, if you could just call my mom, she can explain everything. She banks here too. Her name is Elena Drake. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Nice try. You're not calling anyone until we figure out where you really got this money. For all I know, you're working with adults who sent you in here because they thought a kid would be less suspicious. What Vivian didn't realize was that if she had simply entered Elena Drake into the bank's computer system, she would have discovered a modest checking account belonging to a local parent. Exactly what Celine claimed. But Vivian never bothered to check. Her mind was already made up. As Celine stood there feeling smaller and more helpless with each passing moment, other customers in the bank began to take notice. Some looked uncomfortable with Vivian's obviously hostile treatment of a young girl, but nobody spoke up. In that moment, Celine learned a painful lesson about how the world could be, how people could stand by and watch injustice happen without intervening. The irony was staggering. Here stood Celine Vaughn, the granddaughter of a major banking dynasty, the daughter of one of the most powerful financial executives in the country, being treated like a criminal in a bank that her family's money had helped build and sustain for decades. But Vivian Langford had no way of knowing that. In her mind, she was protecting the bank from a young scammer. In reality, she was about to destroy her own career by targeting the wrong family. As the tension in that bank lobby continued to escalate, Celine felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crack. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing what millions of other young Black Americans faced regularly: the presumption of guilt, the questioning of their legitimacy, the exhausting burden of having to prove their worth to people who had already decided they weren't worthy. Little did anyone in that bank know that in just a short while, everything would change. Celine's mother was about to receive a text message that would transform her from a concerned parent into an avenging force of nature, and Vivian Langford was about to learn that sometimes the people you underestimate have more power than you could ever imagine. Have you ever been discriminated against because of how you looked? Hit the subscribe button now and share your experience with others, as this could inspire someone. Celine stood at that counter, her hands shaking as she pulled out every piece of identification she had brought with her. Her school ID with her smiling photo, her birth certificate that her mother had carefully laminated years ago, her savings account statements from this very same bank showing deposits and withdrawals going back several years. Celine spread these documents across the counter like she was laying down cards in a game where her freedom was the stakes. "Please," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "Look at these. They prove who I am. They prove this is my money." But Vivian Langford looked at those documents with the same expression someone might have when looking at garbage. She didn't even pick them up to examine them properly. Instead, she shook her head with disgust and said the words that would seal her own fate. "These are probably fake too. A young person with no job doesn't have this much money unless she took it from someone." That's when Celine broke. The weight of the injustice, the confusion, the fear, it all came crashing down on her at once. Tears started streaming down her face as the reality hit her. This woman wasn't going to help her. This woman had already decided Celine was guilty before she'd even spoken a word. "Please," Celine sobbed. "I just want to call my mom. She can explain everything." But Vivian's response revealed the true depth of her racism. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper, and said something so vile that other customers nearby actually gasped. "Your mom probably sent you here to launder drug money. I've seen this before with people like you." People like you. There it was again. Celine felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. At her young age, she was learning for the first time that some people would look at her skin color and immediately assume the worst possible things about her and her family. Celine was crying harder now, barely able to speak through her tears. "Please, just let me call her. Just one phone call, please." But Vivian had already made up her mind about what came next. Instead of showing even a shred of human decency, instead of allowing a terrified child to call their parents, Vivian reached for the phone with a satisfied smile on her face. "I'm calling the police," she announced loudly enough for half the bank to hear. "This girl is clearly involved in some kind of fraud or theft, and I'm not going to let her manipulate me with crocodile tears." As Vivian dialed, Celine realized she might have one chance to reach her mother. While Vivian was talking to the police dispatcher, Celine quietly pulled out her phone with trembling fingers. She typed as fast as she could, her tears making it hard to see the screen. "Mom, I'm at Liberty Trust Bank and the manager called the cops on me. She says I stole the money and won't let me call you. I'm scared." Celine hit send just as Vivian finished her call and noticed what she was doing. "Give me that phone," Vivian snapped, lunging forward to grab it. But the message was already sent. It was traveling through cell towers across the city, heading toward a boardroom in a gleaming skyscraper where Celine's mother was having what she thought was just another routine business meeting. Dr. Elena Drake sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table high in the Drake Financial Group building. Around her sat several of the most powerful bank executives in the state, men and women who controlled billions of dollars and made decisions that affected thousands of lives every single day. They were deep into their quarterly review, discussing profit margins and market projections, when Elena's phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at it and saw Celine's name on the screen. Elena had set up a special emergency contact for Celine that would always come through even during important meetings, but Elena never expected to use it. Selena was supposed to be safely at school and then going to the bank for what should have been a simple routine transaction. Elena picked up her phone and read the message. The room full of powerful executives watched as the most controlled, composed woman they knew went through a transformation that was actually frightening to witness. First, confusion crossed her face as she tried to understand what she was reading. Then, as the meaning sank in, confusion turned to shock. And finally, shock transformed into something far more dangerous, pure, cold rage. The temperature in that boardroom seemed to drop. Elena's face became a mask of controlled fury that made everyone around the table unconsciously lean back in their chairs. "Gentlemen," Elena said, her voice so quiet and controlled that it was more terrifying than if she had screamed, "This meeting is over! Someone just made a very costly mistake." She stood up so abruptly that her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. The executives, men and women who were used to being the most important people in any room, suddenly felt very small and very nervous. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" asked Reed Ashcroft, the senior vice president who had been presenting the quarterly numbers. Elena was already walking toward the door, her phone in one hand, her car keys appearing in the other. "Someone at Liberty Trust Bank just arrested my daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in that room knew exactly who Elena Drake was. They knew about her family's banking empire. They knew about her personal net worth. And they all suddenly realized that someone at Liberty Trust had just made what might be the most expensive mistake in banking history. Elena was speed dialing numbers as she walked, her heels clicking against the marble floor like gunshots. First, her personal attorney, Tristan Hale, one of the most feared lawyers in the state. Then her head of security, Harlan Voss, a former police captain who had been protecting the Drake family for years. And finally, a number that she rarely used but always kept close at hand, the direct line to Sterling Voss, the chairman of Liberty Trust Bank's board of directors. "Leo," she called to her driver as she stepped into the elevator. "Bring the car around. We're going to Liberty Trust Bank, now." Back at the bank, Celine was living through every parent's worst nightmare. Two police officers had arrived quickly after Vivienne's call, and they walked into that building with their minds already made up about what they were going to find. Officer Preston Hale, a longtime veteran of the force, approached the customer service counter where Celine stood crying. His partner, Officer Tristan Vaughn, positioned herself nearby. Neither of them seemed interested in hearing Celine's side of the story. "This girl was trying to deposit what I believe is stolen money," Vivienne explained with obvious satisfaction. "She has no legitimate explanation for where she got it, and she's been behaving suspiciously since she walked in here." Celine tried to speak through her tears. "Officers, please, I can explain everything. This is my money. I have all my identification. I just wanted to open a checking account." But Officer Hale barely glanced at her. "We get calls about kids like this all the time," he said dismissively. "Young people involved in theft, drug running, you name it. They always have some story about legitimate money." Celine couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Kids like this." The same phrase Vivienne had used. She was starting to understand that this wasn't just about one racist bank manager. This was about a system that was designed to work against people who looked like her. "Please," Celine begged, "just look at my identification. I go to a good school. My mother banks here too. You can verify everything." But the officers weren't interested in verification. Officer Vaughn was already pulling out her handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," she commanded. Celine froze. "What? Why? I didn't do anything wrong." "You're being detained on suspicion of theft and fraud," Officer Hale explained matter-of-factly. You can explain your story down at the station." The handcuffs clicked around Celine's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire bank lobby. Other customers stopped what they were doing and stared in horror. A few pulled out their phones and started recording. An elderly woman near the teller windows shook her head and muttered, "This is wrong." But nobody stepped forward to help. Nobody demanded that the officers slow down and actually investigate before arresting a young girl. Celine was learning another painful lesson about how the world worked. That most people, even when they knew something was wrong, would choose to stay safe and silent rather than speak up for justice. As the officers led Celine toward the door in handcuffs, Vivienne Langford stood behind her counter with a satisfied smile. In her mind, she had just protected her bank from a young criminal. She had no idea that she had actually just destroyed her own career and possibly her entire future. But across town, a force of nature was heading in her direction. Elena Drake was in the backseat of her car making phone calls that would change everything. Her driver was weaving through traffic like he was driving an ambulance. And in the passenger seat, Elena's head of security was already coordinating with the bank's board of directors. If you want to see Vivienne Langford get exactly what she deserves, you better hit that subscribe button right now because the justice that's coming is going to be absolutely epic. A short while after Celine sent that desperate text message, something extraordinary happened outside Liberty Trust Bank. a sleek black car with tinted windows so dark they looked like mirrors pulled up to the curb. But this wasn't just any luxury car. The license plate bore the initials of a major financial holding company, and anyone in the banking world would have recognized those initials immediately. The car door opened, and Dr. Elena Drake stepped out onto the sidewalk. She wore a custom-tailored suit that fit her like armor. Her jewelry was understated but unmistakably expensive, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that only comes from generational wealth and absolute power. But Elena wasn't alone. Behind her emerged Tristan Hale, one of the most feared attorneys in the state, a man whose hourly rate was higher than most people's monthly salary. Next came Harlan Voss, her head of security and a former police captain whose presence immediately commanded respect. And finally, additional security personnel who looked like they could handle any situation that might arise. Inside the bank, customers who had been going about their normal business suddenly stopped and stared. You could feel the shift in the atmosphere, like the air pressure had changed before a storm. People instinctively moved out of the way as this powerful entourage approached the entrance. Even the police officers who had arrested Celine glanced nervously toward the door. Elena walked through those glass doors with the commanding presence of someone who owned everything she surveyed. Her heels clicked against the marble floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to Judgment Day. Conversations stopped. Phones were lowered. Vivian Langford stood behind her customer service counter, still basking in what she thought was her moment of triumph. She had successfully removed what she believed was a troublemaker from her bank, and she was expecting praise from her superiors for her vigilance. But when Vivian looked up and saw Elena approaching, she had no idea who she was looking at. Despite Elena's photo appearing in financial magazines and business publications for years, Vivian had never connected that face to Celine Vaughn. The banking world knew Elena Drake as a powerful CEO, but the photos were always professional headshots in business settings, never casual family photos, never pictures with her daughter. Elena walked directly to Vivian's counter, her dark eyes fixed on the woman who had dared to harm her child. When she spoke, her voice was so controlled and quiet that it was actually more terrifying than if she had been screaming. "Release my daughter immediately." Vivian looked up at this obviously wealthy woman and felt a moment of confusion, but her arrogance quickly took over and she actually had the audacity to scoff. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but your daughter is a thief. She was trying to deposit stolen money, and I did exactly what I was supposed to do. The police have already taken her away." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, but this wasn't just any business card. It was printed on heavy stock paper with gold lettering that caught the light. She placed it on the counter directly in front of Vivian, with the precision of someone placing a chess piece for checkmate. "I'm Dr. Elena Drake," she said with deadly calm. "My family is Drake Financial Holdings. We don't just bank here, Vivian. We own here." Vivian picked up the business card and read it, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. The name was legendary in banking circles, but surely this couldn't be. "I don't understand," Vivian stammered. "The girl's name is Vaughn, not Drake." Elena's smile was colder than winter. "Drake is my professional name, and you just arrested the granddaughter of the man who founded this bank decades ago." The color began draining from Vivian's face as the magnitude of her mistake started to sink in, but Elena wasn't finished. She was just getting started. "Drake Financial Holdings owns a controlling interest in Liberty Trust Bank," Elena continued, her voice growing stronger and more commanding with each word. "My family has been the controlling shareholder for generations. Every promotion you've ever received, every paycheck you've ever cashed, every benefit you've ever enjoyed, it all came from my family's money." By now, a crowd had gathered around the customer service counter. Other bank employees were emerging from their offices, drawn by the commotion. Customers were pulling out their phones to record what was clearly going to be an epic confrontation. Elena's attorney, Tristan Hale, stepped forward at this point. "Ms. Langford, are you seriously suggesting that a child having birthday money constitutes suspicious activity? Are you aware that racial profiling is a federal crime?" Before Vivian could respond, the main doors of the bank opened again and Sterling Voss, the chairman of Liberty Trust's board of directors, practically ran into the building. He was a distinguished man who had been managing the Drake family's banking interests for decades. Sterling took one look at Elena and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. His face went pale as he approached the growing crowd around Vivian's counter. "Elena," he said, slightly out of breath from his rush to get there. "I came as soon as I got your call. Where's Celine? Is she hurt?" The sight of the bank's chairman rushing in and addressing Elena by her first name, with obvious familiarity, sent shockwaves through the crowd of onlookers. Vivian felt her legs go weak as she realized she might be in more trouble than she had ever imagined. "Sterling," Elena replied, her voice softening slightly when addressing the family friend. "Your employee here accused my young daughter of theft and money laundering. She refused to let Celine call me, refused to verify her identity, and instead called the police to have her arrested. Sterling turned to look at Vivian with an expression of absolute horror. You did what? Vivian tried to defend herself, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Sir, I was just following a protocol for suspicious activity. The girl had a lot of cash and no valid explanation. No valid explanation? Elena interrupted, her voice rising for the first time. She told you it was birthday money from her grandmother. She showed you her identification, her school records, her savings account statements from this very bank. What more explanation did you need? Sterling was already on his phone calling for security footage to be reviewed immediately. Within moments, they were all watching the bank's cameras on a monitor that had been brought out from the security office. The footage was damning. It showed Celine entering the bank, politely approaching Vivian's counter with a smile and presenting her documents respectfully. It showed Vivian immediately becoming hostile, refusing to examine Celine's identification, and treating her with obvious contempt from the very first moment. But more importantly, the footage showed other interactions Vivian had had over recent months, case after case of Vivian giving special scrutiny to minority customers, asking for additional documentation that she didn't require from white customers, and treating people of color with obvious suspicion and hostility. My God, Sterling whispered as he watched the evidence of systematic discrimination playing out on the screen. Vivian, how long has this been going on? But Vivian couldn't answer. She was staring at the monitor in horror, watching her career implode in real time. Every racist assumption, every biased decision, every moment of discrimination was there for everyone to see. Elena turned to Sterling with steel in her voice. Sterling, I want to know how many other customers have been treated this way. I want a full investigation into this woman's conduct, and I want it started immediately. Sterling nodded grimly. It will be done, Elena. I cannot begin to apologize for what has happened here today. This is absolutely inexcusable. But Elena wasn't looking for apologies. She was looking for justice. Where is my daughter now? She's been taken to the juvenile detention center for processing, Sterling replied, already pulling out his phone. But I can have her released immediately. I'll call the chief of police personally. As Sterling made his calls, Elena turned back to Vivian, who was now visibly shaking behind her counter. The irony of the situation was absolutely devastating. Vivian had spent years working her way up in a bank that was owned by the very family she had just attacked. You know what the most tragic part of this is, Vivian? Elena said quietly. My daughter has never experienced racism before today. She's lived a sheltered life protected from people like you. She walked into this bank with complete trust in the system, believing that if she was polite and honest, she would be treated fairly. Vivian tried to speak, but no words came out. Today you stole her innocence, Elena continued. You taught a young girl that some people will hate her for the color of her skin. No matter how educated she is, no matter how polite she is, no matter how legitimate her business is. That's something she can never unlearn. The security guards who had been called to escort Vivian from the building were the same ones who had stood by and watched Celine being handcuffed earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Ms. Langford, Sterling said officially, your employment with Liberty Trust Bank is terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you are permanently banned from all bank properties. As Vivian was led away in disgrace, Elena turned to address the crowd of customers and employees who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Let this be a lesson to everyone here, she said in a voice that carried to every corner of the bank. Racism isn't just morally wrong, it's bad business. It's expensive, and in this case, it just cost someone their entire career. But the story wasn't over yet. Elena still had to get to her daughter, who was sitting in a detention center, probably terrified and confused about how her simple trip to the bank had turned into such a nightmare. What would you have done if you were in Elena's shoes and your daughter was wrongly arrested? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to click the subscribe button for more stories like this. The aftermath of Vivian's firing was swift and absolutely devastating. Within a short time of Chairman Sterling's announcement, security guards were already clearing out Vivian's office. Years of accumulated personal items, family photos, awards, certificates of achievement were unceremoniously dumped into cardboard boxes. Her access cards were revoked, her computer password was changed, and her name was stripped from the employee directory. But the humiliation was just beginning. As word spread through the bank, employees who had worked with Vivian for years began to remember incidents they had previously overlooked. The way she would make jokes about certain customers, how she always seemed to require extra documentation from people of color, the subtle but consistent pattern of discrimination that everyone had noticed, but no one had been brave enough to report. Within a short time, Vivian's professional reputation was in ruins. The banking industry is surprisingly small, and news travels fast through professional networks. By the end of that first day, Vivian's termination and the reasons behind it had spread to banks across the state. By the end of the week, financial institutions nationwide knew exactly what Vivian Langford had done to Celine Vaughn. The story became a cautionary tale whispered in banking conferences and professional development seminars. Vivian's name became synonymous with everything that was wrong with institutional racism in financial services. Her professional profile, once proudly displaying years of steady advancement through various positions, now showed a gap that every potential employer would understand without explanation. But Vivian's punishment was just the beginning of the systemic changes that Celine's case would bring about. The police officers who had arrested Celine without conducting any real investigation suddenly found themselves under the most intense scrutiny of their careers. Officer Preston Hale, a longtime veteran who had prided himself on his quick response times and decisive action, discovered that speed and decisiveness meant nothing without fairness and thorough investigation. His body camera footage was reviewed frame by frame, revealing a pattern of assumptions and biases that his supervisors could no longer ignore. Officer Tristan Vaughn, who had been the one to actually place handcuffs on Celine, found herself facing questions about why she had never asked to see the documents Celine kept trying to show them. Why had she automatically believed Vivian's accusations without verification? Why had she treated a crying young girl like a hardened criminal? Both officers were suspended pending a full internal affairs investigation that would examine not just this incident, but every arrest they had made involving minority suspects over recent years. Their cases were reviewed for patterns of racial bias. Their reports were scrutinized for language that might indicate prejudice, and their training records were examined to see if they had missed crucial education about implicit bias and community policing. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns. Officer Hale had arrested black suspects at a rate nearly 3 times higher than his white colleagues, despite working the same neighborhoods. Officer Vaughn had used force against minority suspects significantly more often than against white suspects in similar situations. The data painted a clear picture of systemic bias that could no longer be ignored. Do you think Vivian and the officer's punishment was enough? Or should there have been even more consequences for what they did to Celine? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because the final chapter of this story is going to show you the long-term impact of what happened in that bank that day. The police department's handling of Celine's case became a case study in what not to do when responding to calls involving minors and people of color. They had failed to verify basic facts, refused to listen to Celine's explanation, and immediately sided with an adult's word over a child's simply because of racial stereotypes and assumptions about economic class. The public outrage was swift and sustained. Community groups that had been complaining about police bias for years suddenly had a perfect example of how the system failed young people of color. The fact that Celine came from a wealthy family only highlighted how much worse the treatment must be for children without powerful advocates. Within a short time, the police department was forced to implement sweeping reforms. New protocols required officers to conduct thorough investigations before making arrests, especially when children were involved. Officers were mandated to complete enhanced bias training regularly. Body camera footage would be randomly reviewed for signs of discriminatory behavior. And most importantly, a civilian oversight board was established to investigate complaints of racial profiling. Meanwhile, Chairman Sterling was working long hours to repair the damage to Liberty Trust Bank's reputation and implement changes that would prevent similar incidents from ever happening again. Most importantly, the bank established a rule that no customer under a certain age could be refused service or reported to authorities without the approval of at least 2 managers and documentation of specific policy violations. But the most important changes were happening in the Drake family's private conversations. The drive home from the juvenile detention center was the longest stretch of both Celine's and Elena's lives. Celine stared out the window, watching familiar neighborhoods pass by, trying to process how her safe, predictable world had suddenly become so complicated and frightening. "Mom," Celine finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "why did that woman hate me so much? I've never even met her before today. I was polite, I had all my documents, I didn't do anything wrong." Elena's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she struggled to find the right words to explain something that she herself still found incomprehensible. How do you tell a young girl that some people will hate her for something as arbitrary as the color of her skin? "Baby," Elena said, pulling the car over to the side of the road so she could give this conversation the attention it deserved. "What happened to you today wasn't about anything you did or didn't do. That woman made assumptions about you based on the color of your skin, and that's called racism. It's ugly and it's wrong, but it's something that exists in this world." Celine turned to look at her mother with confusion and hurt written all over her face. "But we have money, we live in a nice house, I go to a good school, doesn't that matter?" This was the moment Elena had been dreading for years. She had spent Celine's entire life trying to create a bubble where her daughter could grow up free from the harsh realities of prejudice and discrimination. She had carefully crafted a life where Celine would be judged by her character and achievements rather than her race or family wealth. But now that bubble had been shattered, and Elena realized that her protection might have actually left Celine more vulnerable. "Sweetheart," Elena said, taking a deep breath, "I need to tell you something important about our family. We don't just have money. We have a lot of money, more than most people could ever imagine." Over the next stretch of time, sitting in that car on the side of the road, Elena explained everything. The Drake banking dynasty that had started with her great-grandfather generations earlier, the family's current substantial net worth, the fact that they owned controlling interests not just in Liberty Trust Bank, but in dozens of other financial institutions across the country. Celine learned that her comfortable middle-class life had actually been carefully constructed to hide the reality of her family's immense wealth and power. The modest house was actually just one of several properties the family owned. The public school events Elena attended were balanced by private board meetings where she made decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of customers. "Why didn't you tell me?" Celine asked, feeling overwhelmed by these revelations and slightly betrayed by the deception. Elena reached over and took her daughter's hands. "Because I wanted you to develop your own character first. I wanted you to understand the value of hard work, kindness, and humility before you learned about the responsibility that comes with our family's position. I thought I was protecting you from the pressures and expectations that come with extreme wealth. But I realize now that I may have left you unprepared for the real world." Celine was quiet for a long moment, staring down at their joined hands as she processed everything she had learned. "So, we could have stopped what happened today?" "Yes," Elena said firmly, "and we did stop it. But more importantly, we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to other kids who don't have our advantages." That conversation in the car marked the beginning of Celine's transformation from a sheltered teenager into a young activist with a clear sense of purpose. She spent the following weeks reading everything she could about civil rights, economic justice, and the history of discrimination in financial services. She learned about redlining, predatory lending, and the countless ways that banking institutions had been used to perpetuate racial inequality. But Celine also learned about the power of advocacy and the importance of using privilege to fight for others. Within a short time of her arrest, the Drake Family Foundation announced a major new initiative designed to educate young people about their financial rights and provide resources for families who face discrimination in banking. The program, called Financial Justice for All, was comprehensive and ambitious. It included educational workshops for teenagers about their rights when opening accounts or conducting banking business. It provided legal resources for families who face discrimination. It funded community organizations that work to promote financial literacy in underserved communities. And it established a hotline that young people could call if they experienced treatment, similar to what Celine had faced. Celine became the face of the campaign, sharing her story at schools, community centers, and youth organizations across the state. Her message was simple but powerful. Every young person deserved to be treated with dignity and respect when conducting legitimate business, regardless of their race, economic background, or age. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of young people came forward with their own stories of discrimination and unfair treatment. Many had simply accepted poor service or suspicious treatment as normal, not realizing that they had rights and advocates who would fight for them. Liberty Trust Bank, meanwhile, was implementing changes that would become a model for financial institutions across the country. The new youth-friendly policies went far beyond simple bias training. The bank redesigned its customer service approach specifically for minor clients, recognizing that young people might need additional guidance and patience when learning to navigate financial systems. Special youth specialists were hired and trained to work specifically with customers under a certain age. These specialists understood that teenagers might have questions that seemed basic to adults, that they might be nervous about their first banking experiences, and that they deserve the same level of professional service as any adult customer. The bank also created educational materials specifically designed for teenagers who were opening their first accounts. These materials explained banking terminology, outlined customer rights, and provided clear guidelines about what documents were needed for different types of transactions. Most importantly, they established clear protocols to prevent any customer from being treated with suspicion or hostility based on their appearance or assumed economic status. But perhaps the most powerful moment in this entire story came a short while after Vivian's termination, when Elena returned to Liberty Trust Bank to address the remaining staff. She stood in the main lobby where her daughter had been humiliated and arrested, wearing the same commanding presence that had so effectively dismantled Vivian's career. The entire staff was assembled. Tellers, managers, security guards, and administrative personnel. They stood in nervous silence as Elena prepared to speak, knowing that their jobs and the bank's future might depend on what she said next. "My family built wealth in this country despite people like Vivian trying to stop us," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the building. My great-grandfather started with nothing but determination and a belief that financial services should be available to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the neighborhood they came from. She paused to look around the room, making eye contact with individual employees as she continued. He faced discrimination that was legal and openly practiced in his time. Banks refused to serve him. Loan officers told him to his face that they didn't do business with people like him. But he didn't give up. He worked twice as hard, saved every penny, and eventually started his own bank that would serve everyone fairly. Elena's voice grew stronger as she warmed to her theme. Generations later, my daughter walked into this bank, a bank that her ancestors' money helped build, and was treated like a criminal by someone who was paid with my family's money. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so tragic. The room was absolutely silent as Elena continued. Celine will learn from this experience that respect isn't given, it's demanded, and we have the power to demand it. But more importantly, she'll learn that having power means using it to protect people who don't have power. Elena's speech was recorded by local news crews and posted online where it quickly went viral. The video was shared millions of times, becoming a rallying cry for economic empowerment and civil rights. But for Elena, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about ensuring that no other child would go through what Celine had experienced. The speech also served as a clear warning to anyone in the financial services industry who might be tempted to engage in discriminatory practices. The message was unmistakable. The Drake family was watching. They had the resources to fight back, and they weren't afraid to use their power to demand justice. Sometime later, Celine returned to Liberty Trust Bank to finally open that checking account she had originally come for, but this time, she wasn't just a sheltered young girl trying to prove her independence. She was a young woman who understood both her privilege and her responsibility, who had learned hard lessons about the world's injustices, but had also discovered her own power to fight against them. The staff treated her with the utmost respect and professionalism, of course, but Celine made it clear that she expected the same respectful treatment for every young customer who walked through those doors. She had learned that having power means using it to protect people who don't have the same advantages. The account opening process that should have been simple the first time was completed quickly this time. Celine received a welcome packet specifically designed for young customers, a personal introduction to her youth specialist, and a clear explanation of all the services available to her. As for Vivian Langford, her downfall was complete and irreversible. The banking industry's informal networks ensured that her story followed her wherever she tried to find new employment. Financial services companies, insurance firms, and related businesses all knew exactly what she had done and why she had been fired. Vivian discovered that reputation in the professional world is everything, and once it's destroyed, it's almost impossible to rebuild. She found herself working a series of low-paying retail jobs, each one a painful reminder of the career she had thrown away through her own prejudice and hatred. But perhaps the most fitting part of Vivian's punishment was that she was forced to watch from afar as the banking industry she'd been expelled from underwent the very changes that might have saved her career if she had embraced them earlier. Every news story about bias training, every article about inclusive customer service, every recognition that Liberty Trust Bank received for its progressive policies was a reminder of what she could have been part of if she had chosen differently. And Vivian's chance of working in banking again was zero. But her story had become a powerful teaching tool used in bias training programs across the country to illustrate the real-world consequences of discrimination and prejudice. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.